2 hours after giving birth, I placed my newborn daughter in my husband's arms. He didn't reach for her. He took one step backward, looked past her as if she wasn't even there, and quietly said, "I already have another family." For a moment, I honestly thought the medication was making me hear things. The room at Womack Army Medical Center was warm and quiet, except for the soft beeping of the monitor beside my bed. Outside my window, the late afternoon sun was beginning to settle over Fort Liberty. A nurse had just wrapped my daughter in a striped hospital blanket and placed her in my arms. She was beautiful. Tiny fingers, dark hair, my nose. After 12 years of marriage, 3 miscarriages, countless appointments in Raleigh, hormone injections, and more tears than I could count, she was finally here. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Daniel would hold her. He'd probably cry. We'd laugh about how terrified he looked. Instead, he stood beside my hospital bed with one hand on the strap of his duffel bag, already dressed in his Army combat uniform. He was supposed to report back for duty that evening after taking emergency leave for the delivery. I smiled at him despite the exhaustion. "Come here," I whispered. "She wants to meet her dad." He didn't move. "I have to get going. It'll only take a second." His eyes drifted toward the window. Then he sighed. "Rachel," there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Not anger, not guilt, relief. "I already have another family." The words landed so quietly, they almost didn't sound real. I blinked. "What?" "I've been with someone else for years." He rubbed the back of his neck as though he were discussing a late utility bill. "We have a son." I stared at him, waiting for him to smile, waiting for him to say it was some awful joke. He didn't. Then he looked at the baby still sleeping peacefully against my chest. "I'm not putting my name on her birth certificate." The room suddenly felt colder. A nurse walking past the doorway froze for half a second before quietly stepping away again. Daniel kept talking. "I should have told you sooner." "You waited until now?" I asked. "I didn't know how." "No," I said softly. "You didn't want consequences." He looked uncomfortable for the first time. "I'll have a lawyer contact you." I looked down at my daughter. She stretched one tiny hand, completely unaware that her whole world had just changed. I expected to scream, to throw something, to beg. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. Years in Army logistics had taught me something valuable. Panic solves nothing. Planning does. I looked back at Daniel and gave him the smallest smile I'd ever forced. "Then remember this moment." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what I said." For the first time since he walked into the room, he looked uncertain. He shifted his duffel bag higher onto his shoulder. "I have to go." Without touching his daughter even once, he turned and walked out. The automatic door clicked shut behind him. I watched it for several seconds before my body finally began to shake. Not from anger, not even from heartbreak, from the terrifying realization that the man I'd trusted for 12 years had disappeared long before our daughter was born. A few minutes later, the same nurse who'd paused in the hallway returned with a gentle smile. "Are you all right, honey?" I took a slow breath. "No." She nodded as though she'd expected that answer. "What do you need?" I looked at the phone on the bedside table. "I need my cell phone." She handed it to me without asking another question. As I unlocked the screen, I knew exactly who I wasn't going to call. I wasn't calling my husband. I was calling someone who understood paperwork, timelines, and the importance of doing everything the right way. Because if Daniel thought walking out of that room was the end of our story, he had no idea. It was only the beginning. I barely slept that first night. Every time my daughter stirred in the bassinet beside my hospital bed, I reached for her automatically, feeding her, changing her, holding her against my shoulder. It all came naturally. What didn't feel natural was the silence where my husband should have been. Around 5:30 the next morning, the hallway outside my room slowly came to life. Nurses changed shifts. Someone rolled a breakfast cart past my door. A helicopter could be heard in the distance, probably headed toward Pope Army Airfield. I looked down at my daughter sleeping peacefully. "I've got you," I whispered, "no matter what." At exactly 7:12 a.m. my phone buzzed. "Daniel." I let it ring. A few seconds later another call, then another. Finally a text appeared. "Can I come see the baby?" I stared at the screen for several seconds before locking my phone again. Less than 10 minutes later there was a knock on my hospital door. One of the charge nurses stepped inside. "Mrs. Morgan?" "Yes." "There's a gentleman downstairs asking to come up." "I know." She hesitated. "He says he's your husband." "I know." She lowered her voice. "Do you want us to let him in?" I thought about the previous afternoon. He hadn't held his daughter. He hadn't even looked at her. "No." The nurse simply nodded. That's all I needed to know. An hour later, while I was finishing breakfast, another nurse stopped by with a grin she was clearly trying to hide. "I probably shouldn't tell you this." I raised an eyebrow. "But your husband didn't take no very well. What happened?" "He argued with hospital security." I blinked. He actually argued? For about 5 minutes. What did security do? They escorted him back outside. For the first time since giving birth I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because Daniel had always believed rules only applied to other people. Apparently hospital security disagreed. By mid-morning I had already spoken with a hospital social worker, who explained something I hadn't even considered. "Rachel," she said gently, "you don't have to rush any paperwork." "I don't know. I thought both parents had to sign today." She smiled. "Not unless you choose to." That single sentence changed everything. An hour later I met with an attorney from Army Legal Assistance. He listened without interrupting while I described everything Daniel had said. When I finished he leaned back in his chair. First, he said calmly, "I'm sorry." "Thank you." Second, "Don't make any emotional decisions this week." I wasn't planning to. I can tell. He slid a yellow legal pad toward me. "Start writing." "What?" "Everything. The exact words, the times, the witnesses, the dates. If you remember something tomorrow, write that too." I nodded. That sounded familiar. Documentation. In logistics, if something wasn't documented, it practically didn't exist. I spent the next hour writing every detail I could remember. The time Daniel arrived, the color of his duffel bag, the exact sentence he used, even the nurse who paused outside the doorway. Nothing dramatic, just facts. Facts have a way of surviving where emotions don't. Just after lunch my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Daniel. It was a Facebook notification. I almost ignored it. Then curiosity got the better of me. Someone named Ashley Pierce had posted 3 photos at a neighborhood barbecue. One picture showed Daniel standing beside her with his arm around her shoulders. Another showed a little boy, maybe 5 years old, sitting on Daniel's shoulders, both of them laughing. The caption read, "Couldn't ask for a better family." My stomach tightened. The post had been uploaded less than an hour earlier. Public. visible to everyone, including dozens of people from Fort Liberty. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I quietly took a screenshot. Not because I was looking for revenge, because someone who lived two lives had just accidentally let those worlds collide. And for the first time I realized Daniel might be far better at lying than he was at keeping secrets. I didn't go looking for another woman. I went looking for the truth. There was a difference. 3 days after my daughter and I came home to our little brick house in Spring Lake, I sat at my kitchen table while she slept in a bassinet beside me. My coffee had gone cold twice. Every few minutes I'd stop reading paperwork just to make sure she was still breathing. Every new parent I knew said they did the same thing. The legal side of my life was already becoming a full-time job. My attorney Linda Foster called that Tuesday morning. "How are you holding up?" "I've had better weeks, I imagine." She paused. "I have something you should know." I straightened in my chair. "What is it?" "We've started requesting financial records. And there are some inconsistencies." "What kind?" "Let's wait until we have the complete picture." I appreciated that about Linda. She never guessed. She only dealt in facts. That afternoon I decided to drive. Not anywhere important, just somewhere familiar. I loaded my daughter into her car seat, grabbed a coffee from the Starbucks on Skibbo Road, and drove aimlessly around Fayetteville. Sometimes movement helps you think. As I passed one of the neighborhoods just outside Fort Liberty, my phone buzzed. It was Melissa, an old friend from work. "You busy?" "Just driving." I wasn't sure whether to tell you this. "Tell me what?" "I saw Daniel." My hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Where?" "At the Harris Teeter on Ramsey Street." "Okay." He wasn't alone. I figured. Melissa hesitated. "There was a little boy." I stayed quiet. "He called Daniel Dad." That hurt far more than I expected. Not because Daniel had another child, because he had chosen to be a father, just not to ours. When I got home, I found another envelope from Linda waiting in my mailbox. Inside were copies of property records. One address immediately caught my attention: an apartment lease, less than 15 minutes from post. It had been active for almost 5 years. 5 years. I counted backward. That meant he'd signed it while we were celebrating our 7th wedding anniversary. I remembered that anniversary. Daniel had surprised me with dinner at a little seafood restaurant in Southern Pines. He'd brought flowers. He'd toasted many more years together. The lease had been signed 3 days earlier. I closed my eyes. Some lies don't simply replace the truth. They rewrite your memories. That evening Linda called again. "We've confirmed a joint checking account with her." "Yes." "Anything else?" "A vehicle loan." I let out a slow breath. So this wasn't just an affair? No. It appears he was supporting 2 households. I looked toward the living room where my daughter was sleeping. "What happens now?" "Legally?" "Personally?" Linda didn't answer immediately. Finally she said, "That's the harder question." After we hung up, I sat alone. For nearly an hour. Part of me wanted to expose everything immediately, post every document online, send copies to everyone Daniel worked with, tell the whole world. Another part of me imagined a little boy who had done nothing wrong. If I blew up Daniel's life overnight, that child would be caught in the explosion too. That thought stopped me. Revenge was easy. Collateral damage wasn't. The next morning Melissa stopped by with homemade chicken soup. She looked around my quiet kitchen before saying, "You know what scares me?" "What?" You're trying harder to protect everyone else than the man who hurt you ever did. I laughed softly. I don't want innocent people paying for his choices. She smiled. Then don't punish innocent people. What about Daniel? Melissa picked up one of the folders stacked on my table. Rachel. She tapped the paperwork gently. The truth isn't revenge. It's accountability. For the first time all week, those two words felt completely different, and I realized I didn't need to destroy Daniel. I simply needed to stop protecting him. Life settled into a strange routine. Every 3 hours my daughter needed to eat. Every few hours after that, she'd fall asleep on my chest while I watched the evening news or folded tiny onesies at the dining room table. Somewhere in between diapers and bottles, I answered emails from my attorney and tried to remember what a full night's sleep felt like. 1. Thursday morning, Linda called before 9 o'clock. I've got the first draft of Daniel's financial disclosure. That was fast. He wasn't expecting us to ask for everything. I smiled faintly. People who think they're in control usually aren't prepared for paperwork. She laughed. I can see why you worked in Army logistics. So what's missing? Several things. I sat down. Tell me. His income doesn't match his expenses. Meaning? Meaning someone is paying bills that don't appear anywhere on his official disclosures. I thought about the apartment, the joint checking account, the little boy. He can't explain that. No, Linda replied. But he might try. That afternoon, I met Linda at her office in downtown Fayetteville. She spread several folders across the conference table. I want to show you something. One document listed Daniel's basic allowance for housing. Another showed the apartment lease. Another contained tax records. She pointed at the dates. See the overlap? I nodded slowly. He was receiving benefits while maintaining another residence that wasn't disclosed. Could that be a problem? It could become one. I stared at the papers. I don't want to ruin his career. Linda folded her hands. I've been waiting for you to say that. I mean it. He deserves consequences. Maybe, but I never wanted revenge to become destruction. Linda looked at me for a long moment. Rachel listened carefully. She slid the folders back toward herself. You are not creating these documents. No. You are not changing these dates. No. You are not inventing another family. No. So whose decisions are these? I didn't answer. She did. His. That stayed with me the whole drive home. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that one phone call could send years of his work crashing down. Was I really ready for that? That evening Daniel called. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks I answered. Hello. His voice sounded unusually calm. We need to talk. We are talking. I mean face to face. No. This doesn't have to get ugly. I almost laughed. Became ugly in a maternity room. Silence. Finally he said, You're trying to destroy me. No. You've hired lawyers. So have you. I made a mistake. I looked toward my daughter sleeping peacefully in her swing. A mistake is forgetting our anniversary. He said nothing. A mistake is backing into someone's mailbox. I took a slow breath. Building another family over 6 years isn't a mistake, Daniel. It's a series of choices. His voice hardened. If this reaches my command, I interrupted him. I haven't contacted your command. You could. I could. Another silence. Then he tried a different approach. For our daughter's sake. That sentence stopped me cold. Not because it changed my mind. Because it was the first time he'd acknowledged she existed. Our daughter? I asked quietly. You said you weren't putting your name on her birth certificate. You don't get to rewrite that conversation. He exhaled heavily. I was upset. So was I. But I didn't abandon anyone. After we hung up, I sat in the nursery for a long time. The room was quiet except for the gentle hum of the baby monitor. I wanted peace. I wanted fairness. Most of all, I wanted my daughter to grow up knowing that telling the truth wasn't an act of cruelty. Sometimes it was the only path left. The next morning, Linda called again. Rachel. Yes. I think we've someone who may not know the whole story. Who? The other woman. I frowned. What do you mean? Linda's voice became very quiet. I don't think she knows you're still married. For the second time since giving birth, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Maybe Daniel hadn't been lying only to me. Maybe he'd been lying to everyone. I spent the next 2 days trying to decide whether I even wanted to meet the other woman. Every instinct told me to avoid her. I'd already lost enough sleep. I wasn't interested in another confrontation, another argument, or another person telling me they were sorry. But Linda kept coming back to one sentence. I don't think she knows the truth. On Friday afternoon, while my daughter napped, Linda called again. She agreed to meet. Just like that? She sounded confused more than anything. Where? A coffee shop in Southern Pines. Public place tomorrow morning. I looked over at the baby monitor. What if this is a trap? Linda chuckled softly. I've practiced family law for 23 years. Fair point. If I thought you were walking into a trap, I'd cancel it. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and North Carolina humidity that had already settled in before 9 o'clock. Melissa came over to stay with my daughter. You sure about this? She asked as she handed me my purse. No. Good. I looked at her. Good. If you weren't nervous, I'd worry. The drive to Southern Pines took about 40 minutes. I arrived early and chose a table near the front window. At exactly 10 o'clock, a woman walked through the door carrying a little boy on her hip. She looked younger than I expected. Mid-30s maybe. Blonde ponytail. Jeans. A faded army spouse sweatshirt. The little boy couldn't have been older than 5. She looked around until her eyes found mine. Neither of us smiled. She walked over slowly. Rachel. Yes. I'm Ashley. She glanced at Linda before sitting down. The little boy leaned against her shoulder, sleepy after the drive. For several seconds nobody spoke. Finally, Ashley broke the silence. I don't understand why we're here. Linda looked at me. I took a slow breath. I'm Daniel's wife. Ashley blinked. Then she laughed. Not because anything was funny, because she honestly thought I'd made a mistake. No. I wish I had. He told me you divorced years ago. The room suddenly became very quiet. I reached into my folder and slid a copy of my marriage certificate across the table. Ashley stared at it, then at me, then back at the paper. Her voice disappeared. She shook her head. No. I quietly handed her another document. A family photograph from our 10th wedding anniversary. The date was printed clearly on the back. Ashley looked at it for nearly a full minute. Finally she whispered, "He said you were his ex-wife." "I'm not. He said you had moved to Virginia." "I've lived in Spring Lake the entire time." She covered her mouth. The little boy looked up at her. "Mommy." She stroked his hair without taking her eyes off me. I thought she whispered. "What?" "I thought your baby belonged to someone else." I stared at her. What? That's what Daniel told me. For a second neither of us spoke. Then, completely against my expectations, we both laughed. Not because it was amusing, because the lie was so unbelievable that neither of us knew what else to do. Ashley wiped away tears. Oh my goodness. I've defended that man for 6 years. She looked embarrassed. I thought I was helping him survive a terrible divorce. I slowly closed my folder. You didn't know? She shook her head. If I'd known he was still married, she couldn't even finish the sentence. For the first time since walking into the coffee shop, I didn't see the woman who had unknowingly become part of my husband's deception. I saw another victim. Someone who had believed the same man. Someone raising a little boy who deserved better. As we stood to leave, Ashley hesitated. Rachel. Yes. There's something you should probably see. What is it? He rented a storage unit. I frowned. I've never been there. I have. She looked down at her son before meeting my eyes again. I think that's where he's been hiding the rest of his life. I had come expecting an enemy. Instead, I walked away with a witness. And somehow that was a far bigger surprise. The storage facility sat just outside Hope Mills, tucked behind a row of auto repair shops and a Dollar General. If I hadn't known it was there, I would have driven right past it. Ashley parked beside my car and turned off the engine. I haven't been here in almost a year, she said. Why not? He told me he didn't need the unit anymore. But he kept paying for it. She nodded. I never questioned it. Neither of us spoke as we walked toward the office. The manager recognized Ashley immediately. Morning, he said with a smile. Need back into Unit 214. Ashley forced a polite smile. Yes. A few minutes later, we stood in front of a faded green roll-up door. Ashley unlocked the padlock. I don't know what's in here anymore. She pulled the door open. Dust floated through the warm air. At first glance it looked ordinary. Plastic storage bins, old camping equipment, a folded stroller, a couple of cardboard boxes. Then I noticed the filing cabinet. Linda, who had joined us, quietly said, "Let's go through this carefully." We worked slowly. No shouting. No dramatic discoveries. Just one document after another. Inside the cabinet were bank statements going back years. There were receipts from jewelry stores I had never visited. Hotel reservations from weekends when Daniel had claimed to be attending military training. A folder labeled taxes contained copies of returns that didn't match the ones I'd signed. Linda took pictures of everything. Don't move anything unless we document it first. That sounded exactly like something I would have said at work. Facts first. Conclusions later. Ashley opened another box. Inside were dozens of birthday cards. Some were addressed to her son. Others were addressed to Daniel. One handmade card caught my attention. Crayon drawings, stick figures. Across the front were the words, "Best Daddy Ever." Ashley sat down on a folding chair and covered her face. I really believed we were building a family. I sat beside her. So did I. For a while neither of us said anything. 2 women, 1 man, 2 completely different lives. The only thing we had in common was that we both trusted him. Near Clear's throat, the back of the unit, I found an old laptop. Beside it sat a small fireproof box. Inside were several flash drives and a stack of notebooks. Daniel had always kept journals. He said writing helped him organize his thoughts. I never imagined those notebooks would become evidence. Linda carefully placed everything into evidence bags. We'll review these later. As we prepared to leave, Ashley picked up one final envelope. It contained photographs. Some were from birthdays, some from vacations. Then she froze. What? She handed me one picture. It showed Daniel standing in front of Cinderella Castle at Disney World. Ashley and her son were beside him. The date printed in the corner made my stomach tighten. That weekend Daniel had told me he was attending a mandatory leadership conference in Georgia. I remembered spending those 3 days alone because I'd been recovering from another failed fertility treatment. I closed my eyes. For a brief moment anger washed over me so hard I could barely breathe. Then it passed. I looked at Ashley. This isn't your fault. She shook her head. I should have asked more questions. And I should have noticed more things. Linda gently interrupted us. Neither of you created the lies. She locked the evidence case. He did. On the drive home I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired, very tired, because every new piece of evidence answered one question, while creating another. How could someone live 2 completely different lives for 6 years? That night, after putting my daughter to sleep, I stood beside her crib for a long time. I thought about all the documents we'd collected, every receipt, every statement, every photograph. I could have used every single one to destroy Daniel, but that wasn't the example I wanted to set for my daughter. Justice didn't require exposing every ugly detail. It required telling the truth and only the truth that mattered. The next Monday morning Linda called. The court hearing has been scheduled. When? 3 weeks from today. I looked out the kitchen window as the sun rose over our quiet neighborhood. For weeks I'd been preparing documents. Soon I'd have to prepare myself. 3 weeks passed faster than I expected. By then my daughter had started sleeping in slightly longer stretches. I was finally getting 4 hours of uninterrupted sleep on a good night, which felt like a luxury. The divorce hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning at the Cumberland County Courthouse in Fayetteville. Melissa arrived at my house just after 7 o'clock. "I've got her," she said, reaching for the diaper bag. I kissed my daughter's forehead. "I won't be gone any longer than I have to." Melissa smiled. "You already won something." I looked at her. "What?" "You stopped being afraid." I wasn't sure she was right. I was still afraid, just not of Daniel anymore. The courthouse was exactly what you'd expect: security screening, metal detectors, people carrying folders and coffee cups, couples avoiding eye contact, parents holding children's hands, real life unfolding one difficult conversation at a time. Linda met me near courtroom 3B. "You ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be." She handed me a bottle of water. "Remember." "I know. Answer only what's asked." I nodded. "Facts, not speeches, not revenge." "Facts." Daniel walked in a few minutes later. He looked exactly the way he always had before important meetings. Perfectly pressed uniform, fresh haircut, polished boots. If someone had seen him for the first time that morning, they probably would have described him as disciplined, reliable, professional. Only I knew how carefully that image had been built. He glanced at me for just a second, then looked away. His attorney, a well-dressed man in his 50s, smiled politely at Linda. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The hearing began quietly. No shouting, no dramatic objections, just questions. Daniel's attorney spoke first. "Major Morgan admits the marriage has broken down." Daniel nodded solemnly. "We're asking the court to divide the marital assets fairly." Linda remained calm. Then came the sentence I had expected. My client also believes Mrs. Morgan's recent childbirth has understandably made this situation more emotional. I looked straight ahead. Linda gently touched my arm. She knew I wanted to react. Instead, she stood. Your Honor, we'd like to begin with financial disclosures. For nearly an hour, document after document appeared on the courtroom screens. Apartment leases, joint accounts, credit card statements, property records. Every exhibit had been organized chronologically. Every date matched. Every signature had been verified. Daniel's confidence slowly disappeared. His attorney frowned more with each page. Finally, the judge looked toward Daniel. Major Morgan? Yes, Your Honor. Is this apartment lease yours? Yes. And this checking account? Yes. The judge nodded once. Very well. No anger, no raised voice, just another fact added to the record. Then Linda called me to testify. I walked to the witness stand, raised my right hand, took the oath. She asked simple questions. My name, my occupation, our marriage date, my daughter's birth date. Then she asked, what happened in your hospital room on the afternoon your daughter was born? I answered exactly as I had written it down 3 weeks earlier. No exaggeration, no tears, no dramatic pauses. I repeated Daniel's words exactly. Nothing more, nothing less. When I finished, Daniel's attorney stood for cross-examination. Mrs. Morgan? Yes. Would you agree childbirth is emotionally overwhelming? Absolutely. So, it's possible you misunderstood your husband's statements? No. People sometimes remember stressful events differently. They do. So your memory could be mistaken. I looked directly at him. No. Why are you so certain? Because I wrote his exact words down less than 2 hours later. Linda handed the notebook to the bailiff. The attorney flipped through several pages. Every line had dates, times, names. He slowly closed it. I see. He sat down without another question. For the first time that morning, I noticed Daniel wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the tabletop. The judge reviewed his notes for a long moment before speaking. Counselor, he said to Linda, you indicated there is one additional witness? Yes, Your Honor. Linda stood. The petitioner calls Lieutenant Sarah Collins. I frowned. That wasn't a name I recognized. A woman in navy blue nursing scrubs walked through the courtroom doors. Then I realized she wasn't a lieutenant in the Army. She was the charge nurse from the maternity ward. And suddenly I understood why Linda had waited until now. Lieutenant Sarah Collins walked to the witness stand with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years making life-and-death decisions without raising her voice. She looked exactly the way I remembered her. Kind eyes, short brown hair. The same steady expression she'd worn the afternoon my daughter was born. After taking the oath, she adjusted the microphone. Linda smiled politely. Lieutenant Collins, could you tell the court your occupation? I'm a registered nurse and charge nurse in the Labor and Delivery Unit at Womack Army Medical Center. How long have you worked there? 14 years. Were you on duty on June 18th? Yes. Did you have contact with Mrs. Morgan? I did. Linda nodded. Please describe what you observed. The courtroom became very quiet. Sarah never looked at me. She simply answered the questions. I entered Mrs. Morgan's room several times after the delivery. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, I observed Major Morgan standing near the hospital bed. Did you see him holding the baby? No. Did you ever see him touch the baby? No. Daniel shifted in his chair. Linda continued. Did you hear any of the conversation? I wasn't standing inside the room the entire time, but I clearly heard one statement. What statement? Sarah looked toward the judge. I heard Major Morgan say he already had another family. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Daniel's attorney stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is recalling a conversation from several weeks ago. The judge looked at Sarah. Lieutenant Collins? She answered calmly. I documented the incident before the end of my shift. Daniel's attorney froze. Linda reached into her folder. Your Honor, we'd like to enter the nursing incident report into evidence. The judge accepted the document. He read it quietly. Then he adjusted his glasses and looked back at Sarah. This report was completed the same day. Yes, Your Honor. Why? Sarah didn't hesitate. Because the interaction concerned me. Daniel stared at the table. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked genuinely nervous. Linda wasn't finished. Lieutenant Collins, after Major Morgan left the room, did you speak with Mrs. Morgan? Yes. What did she ask you for? My cell phone, Sarah corrected gently. Her own cell phone. And why do you remember that? Because she didn't ask us to call her husband. Sarah glanced toward me for the first time. She asked for her phone so she could start taking notes. A faint smile crossed Linda's face. No further questions. During cross-examination, Daniel's attorney tried to challenge the report. Lieutenant Collins, hospitals are busy places. They are. You see hundreds of patients. Yes. So it's possible you've confused this case with another. Sarah smiled politely. No. Why not? Because I've never before watched a father refuse to even look at his newborn child. The courtroom fell silent again. Even Daniel's attorney seemed to realize there wasn't much left to ask. I have no further questions. As Sarah stepped down, Linda stood once more. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd also like to introduce hospital security records confirming Major Morgan returned the following morning and was denied access at Mrs. Morgan's request. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. The timestamps matched. Security logs, visitor records, incident notes, everything lined up. Finally, the judge leaned back in his chair. He looked directly at Daniel. Major Morgan. Yes, Your Honor. You've repeatedly suggested your wife's testimony was influenced by emotion. Yes. The judge tapped the stack of documents. What I'm seeing instead is remarkable consistency. No one spoke. Then, with the slightest hint of dry humor, the judge added, it appears paperwork has an excellent memory. A few people in the gallery smiled despite themselves. Even I almost did. Daniel certainly didn't. His shoulders, once perfectly square, seemed to sink a little lower. The confident officer who had walked into the courtroom that morning was disappearing, and the man who remained looked like someone realizing that every decision he'd made over the past 6 years had quietly found its way back to him. The hearing paused for lunch before the final arguments. As Linda gathered her files, she leaned toward me. We're almost there. I nodded. For the first time since my daughter was born, I believed her. When court resumed after lunch, the room felt different. The confidence Daniel had carried in that morning was gone. He still sat with his back straight, but his eyes stayed fixed on the table instead of the judge. His attorney whispered something to him more than once, yet Daniel barely responded. Linda leaned toward me. One more step. I nodded. I wasn't hoping for revenge anymore. I was hoping for closure. The judge invited both attorneys to make their closing statements. Daniel's attorney stood first. Your Honor, no. One disputes that my client made serious personal mistakes. However, this court is here to dissolve a marriage, not to punish a military officer for unrelated conduct. He spoke calmly and professionally. I understood his job. He had to work with the facts he had. Linda rose next. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. This case isn't about perfection. She walked slowly toward the bench. It's about honesty. She paused. Mrs. Morgan didn't ask this court to destroy Major Morgan. She glanced toward me. She asked this court to recognize what actually happened. Linda briefly summarized the evidence. The second residence, the undisclosed financial accounts, the documented statements in the hospital, the testimony from the charge nurse, the timeline. Every piece fit together. When she finished, she simply said, "The truth is enough." Then she returned to her seat. The judge spent several minutes reviewing his notes. No one spoke. Even the air conditioning seemed loud. Finally, he looked up. The court has reached its decision. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. He began with custody. Given the circumstances presented, and considering the best interests of the child, primary physical custody will remain with Mrs. Morgan. I quietly closed my eyes. Then came child support. Because Daniel was legally established as the biological father through DNA testing completed during the proceedings, the judge ordered ongoing financial support, according to North Carolina guidelines. Next came the marital assets. Several accounts Daniel had failed to disclose were included in the final division. The judge didn't sound angry. He sounded disappointed. Financial transparency is not optional during these proceedings. Daniel simply answered, "Yes, Your Honor." Then the judge added something I hadn't expected. The evidence presented today may have implications outside this courtroom. Any administrative matters are for the appropriate military authorities to review, not this court. That was it. No dramatic speeches, no courtroom applause, just a judge doing his job. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. There were no television cameras, only ordinary people walking back to work after lunch. Life continued exactly as it should. A week later, I received a call from someone I hadn't expected. Colonel James Whitaker, Daniel's brigade commander. "Mrs. Morgan?" "Yes, sir." "I won't discuss any internal personnel matters." "I understand. I only wanted to say I'm sorry for what you and your daughter experienced." His words were simple, sincere. They didn't reflect the values we expect from our officers. "Thank you, Colonel. I wish you both the very best." The call lasted less than 2 minutes. It meant more than I expected. Several months passed. Friends from post quietly told me Daniel had been removed from a leadership assignment, while administrative reviews were completed. No one celebrated. No one mocked him. People simply accepted that actions carry consequences. One Saturday afternoon in October, my phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. I was wondering, he hesitated, could I meet my daughter? I looked across the living room. She was crawling across the rug laughing as she chased a stuffed giraffe Melissa had given her. I smiled before answering. "You remember the day she was born?" Silence. Then a quiet yes. "I asked you to hold her." Another silence. Finally he whispered, "I know. You made your choice that day." I didn't say it to hurt him. I said it because it was true. When the call ended, I picked up my daughter and held her close. She wrapped one tiny hand around my finger. In that moment I realized something. Justice hadn't come because Daniel lost part of the life he'd built on lies. Justice came because my daughter would grow up surrounded by people who chose her every single day. A year can change a life in ways you never expect. By the time my daughter turned one, our little house in Spring Lake finally felt like home again. The silence that had once reminded me of loss had been replaced by laughter, nursery songs, and the sound of tiny feet learning to chase the family dog around the living room. I had gone back to work part-time with the Army Logistics Office. My coworkers never treated me like someone who needed pity. They treated me like Rachel. That was exactly what I wanted. Every morning followed a familiar rhythm. Coffee, a quick check of emails, packing my daughter's daycare bag, driving past the same pine trees that lined Bragg Boulevard. Life wasn't exciting. It was peaceful. And after everything we'd lived through, peace felt like an incredible gift. Ashley and I had stayed in touch. Neither of us had planned for that. The first few conversations were awkward. Then they became easy. Her little boy and my daughter met for the first time at a community picnic hosted by one of the churches in Fayetteville. Children don't carry adult resentments. Within 10 minutes they were sharing bubbles and chasing each other across the grass. Ashley smiled. I wish we'd met years ago. So do I. We sat together watching the children play. I spent so many years thinking I was competing with another woman. So did I. It turns out, she laughed softly. We were both competing against the same lie. For the first time that sentence didn't hurt. It simply sounded true. A few weeks later I received one final letter from the court confirming that every remaining financial matter had been completed. I placed the envelope in a drawer and closed it. Not because I wanted to forget, because I no longer needed to keep looking at it. One evening after putting my daughter to bed, I found myself thinking about that afternoon in the hospital. The room, the clear throat sunlight, the silence after Daniel's words. I remembered smiling and saying, "Then remember this moment." For months I believed those words had been meant for him. Eventually I realized they were really meant for me. Remember this moment. Remember how it feels when someone shows you exactly who they are. Remember that dignity is worth protecting. Remember that kindness doesn't require accepting betrayal. Most importantly, remember that healing begins the day you stop waiting for someone else to become the person you hoped they would be. People sometimes ask whether I ever got revenge. I usually smile because revenge wasn't watching Daniel face the consequences of his own decisions. Revenge wasn't the paperwork. It wasn't the courtroom. It wasn't the settlement. The greatest victory was much quieter than that. It was watching my daughter grow up knowing she was deeply loved. It was building a home where honesty mattered more than appearances. It was waking up every morning without wondering what secret might be waiting around the next corner. That kind of freedom is hard to describe unless you've lived without it. If you've ever had someone betray your trust, I hope you remember this. Someone else's choices do not define your future. You always have the power to decide what kind of life comes next. Thank you for spending this time with me and listening to my story. If it meant something to you, I'd love to hear what lesson stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family, and finding strength after heartbreak, I hope you'll join me again for another one. The end.